now I shift to English, right, which will be the official language of our event. And first of all, I want to thank very much Professor Rebecca Lemon and Professor Arthur Marotti for being here with us, and to thank you all for being here. That's the reason we are together. And this event wants to achieve a number of things, and the first one has already been achieved by the sheer fact that we are here and we are together. I think that there's no serious academic work that can be made without exchange, without bringing together different points of view, different parts of the country. We have Professor Galindo from Brasilia, Professor Juliana coming from Rio de Janeiro, Professor Sandro from Pará, and colleagues from São Paulo, different institutions, and our students from different parts as well. So the first thing I think has been achieved. Academic debate is a public good. It's not something to be within the walls of a school. It is something to make the life of the country better. And even if we are discussing things which seem so far away, so far-fetched, right, so that scholars feel good about themselves and how smart they are, if this does not affect the people of those who need it most, who need more social justice, better political institutions, then it has very little point. And the way it can affect is if it is translated into a political debate within our country. So Shakespeare is important because we are important. It's not the other way around, right? Shakespeare is important because it can help us think things better for people who are alive today, not people who died 400 years ago. But he is still crucially important. So the first thing I think has already been achieved, and I thank you all for that. Second thing I think is important for us to discuss is what exactly is the point of discussing law and literature? Law and literature, these two ideas have been together in Brazil on and off for a long time, but usually in a not very productive manner. Judges and lawyers, right, they like to quote their verse, and they like to say that they read Dostoevsky, right? And now and again in a sentence or opinion, you're going to see a literary quote, but it doesn't mean anything really, right? The fact is that it's not productive. It was just a way of showing off some sort of cultural background. And this is a pity, because I think there's a lot to learn from the debate between these two kinds of discourse, these two genres. Law has to do with producing certainty. Law has to do with defining things. And a great portion of literature, and why it is so interesting, is that because it thrives on uncertainty. It thrives on multiple senses. And however, both comes from a deeply rooted consensus. You cannot have a reader, an author communicating without some sort of consensus. You cannot have law and society working together without some sort of consensus. It's a complex, difficult consensus. So I think that one of the things would be interesting for us to discuss in here is what exactly is the kind of relation that we consider to be productive between the discourses of law and the discourses of literature. So that's the second point. And the third point is more precisely about, of course, Shakespeare and the early modern period. And I am convinced that this can be very productive. And by reading Professor Marotti's and Professor Lemon's work, I'm even more convinced that this is very productive. In a way, when you talk about early modern, we already bring up the word modern into play. So it means that we recognize something that they had and that we also do. But by qualifying it by early, we are also saying that there are differences, that they are not like us entirely. So I think that an important thing in an event like this is that early moderns, they try perhaps, I don't know, that's something we have to discuss and debate. They are trying to, coming out of the medieval world, they are trying to come up with some of the key concepts that would form what we understand as modernity. So what subjectivity, what exactly subject is, in both senses, political and personal, what a subject is. What is the basis for authority? What is the place of the private, of the public, of affections, of so on and so forth. And I think they try to start shaping these concepts, and we are trying to So in a way, they are trying to integrate these concepts, and we are dealing with the disintegrations of these concepts. But maybe I believe we can learn a lot from their work. Okay, and and I'm sure, I don't want to anticipate anything, but you're going to love what you're going to hear in here. Now, a word about the structure of the event. The reason the room is like this is that we want more debate and less long exposition, right? And I think it is a tribute to the quality of the two scholars who are visiting us, is that they will talk, of course, we're going to listen to them, but people can ask them a variety of things and dialogue with them because they have a range of expertise that will, I think, help us eliminate the discussion here. So there'll be a talk around 50 minutes, right, more or less. And then I'm going to have a short break, and then I'm going to have a comment, and then it's going to be open for debate. I think that the core of this event is that we all participate, right? Some people, English should not be a problema, right? If people feel uncomfortable, there's always somebody who can help. But it's what you're saying, not how we're saying it, that matters. It's important that we get together and exchange ideas, because that's what the academia is all about, or should be all about. Okay? I really want to thank everybody again, and very much like to thank Oscar, who has a number of important appointments. Yes. Class at 9 is yes. His poker club meets at. Okay. All right. Okay, so there seems to have been a misprint, and originally we would have Professor Lemon speaking today and Professor Marotti tomorrow. Because of José Reinaldo, who's not here yet, but he must have had a problem, we have shifted this to have Professor Marotti speaking today and Professor Lemon tomorrow. However, they will both discussing each other's papers during the day. Okay, is that all right? So, thank you very much, everyone, and I'll. Yeah, people have the handout already, right? You have received a handout with the codes. They already have them. Yeah, I'll see if they need more. Okay, has that? Todo mundo tem o handout aí? No. Okay, see you can share, and I'll order some extra copies. Okay? No. We're talking about Shakespeare quotes here. No, okay. So we'll see. Not Shakespeare quotes. Just the first one. So, well, they're literary quotes. I'll see what's going on. Okay. Professor Marotti, thank you.
I want to thank Joseph for inviting me. This is my 11th visit to Brazil. I like to boast that I've never been to Rio de Janeiro. I don't know if that's a boast. I always come to Sao Paulo. I always meet with Jose and his family. I run an exchange program with two federal universities, Minas Gerais and Santa Catarina. I visit them, and I've spoken at both of those universities. I've spoken at USP and a number of other universities. I want to start by admitting that I'm not an expert in Shakespeare and the law. I have nowhere near the knowledge of this subject that Professor Lemon does, whom I recommended as a participant in this. My specialization is early modern literature, and I have two particular interests that I've followed in my publications. One is an interest in lyric poetry in manuscript and print, especially in manuscript, and I do a lot of research on manuscript collections of poetry from the period. Sometimes these collections are mixed up with other materials, notes that people took on their reading, practical information. They kept commonplace books of various kinds of material, and poetry got inserted into that. And poetry was a very social phenomenon exchanged between people. People would answer poems with their own poems. So I got interested particularly in the social dimension of literature, and literature as having a social history. My other interest started more recently in the mid-1990s. I started getting interested in the phenomenon of early modern English Catholicism. The particular historical accounts of the period, usually written from what could be called a Protestant Whig point of view, told a story of a country that was ready for reformation and needing it, having a corrupt Catholic Church and clergy, unreasonable pressure from the papacy in Rome, and Protestantism began a process of liberalization and democratization that went all the way up into the modern period. This is the Whig Protestant view of English nationhood and of English history. Catholic history and the history of English Catholics, which is a continuous one, got pushed to the side. I was uncomfortable with that, and I was interested especially in literary texts that showed the persistence of and the kind of counter discourses that English Catholics had in the period. And my last scholarly monograph is called Religious Ideology and Cultural Fantasy, Catholic and Anti-Catholic Discourse in Early Modern England. And one of the things that study, as I pursued it, drove home to me was the fact that history is not simply a matter of military conflicts, constitutional developments, legal transactions, governmental operation. It's a history also of fantasies, of the things that people believe. And there's a kind of history of fantasies that is parallel to a more hard-headed kind of history. And what people thought was happening is as important as what was really happening, because it affected the way they behaved. And so I pursued this as a kind of course of study. I ended up having my book reviewed more in historical journals than in literary journals, which was interesting. And I made an admission up front. I'm not a historian. I'm not a professional historian. But the historians picked up on what I was doing. And it was a case of we're at a moment in which historians and literary scholars are talking to one another more. Historians are looking to literature for evidence of what was happening culturally and what was being understood. So it's a bringing together of discourses. It's a bringing together of methodologies that come from those two disciplines. This is a very long introduction to a paper that reveals somewhat my interest in early modern English Catholicism in relation to questions of spiritual and temporal authority and how these enter into the problems that Shakespeare sets forth in his plays. Now, one of the things that's basic to our understanding of Shakespeare is an understanding of how drama worked in the period. There's a very good book by a man named Joel Altman called The Tudor Play of Mind. And what he emphasizes is that on the stage, Shakespeare and other dramatists like to set forth debates over particular important issues. And this comes out of the education system they have, where the usual way of explaining things of learning things is to have disputations. But when you have disputations or debates, people have to be able to argue both sides of an issue. And that's what Shakespeare does very often. He argues both sides of an issue, or maybe even 3 or 4 sides of an issue. And he stages these debates in the drama. Not that he wants to drive home the truth of any one, but he thinks it's more important to stage all the conflicting points of view and let the audience be challenged and to think critically about them. All right, that's general background. My particular paper is Shakespeare, Papal Temporal Power, Regicide, and Tyrannicide. I'll be referring to quotes that you have on your sheet. Some of them I'll read completely. Some of them I'm going to have to shorten because they're too long. In King John, a play about a monarch whom some English Protestant writers such as John Bale praised as an heroic anti-papalist and proto-Protestant, William Shakespeare dramatizes a confrontation between the English king and the Pope's legate, in which the relationship between royal sovereignty and papal temporal power is at stake. It's a scene in which both English and French kings are on stage together. After the papal legate demands, in Pope Innocent's name, that King John not block Stephen Langton's assumption of the post of Archbishop of Canterbury, John replies, and this is your first quote in the handout, and I'm just skipping to the latter part of the quote. What earthly name to interrogatories can task the free breath of a sacred king? Thou canst not, Cardinal, devise a name so slight, unworthy, and ridiculous to charge me to an answer as the Pope. Tell him this tale, and from the mouth of England add thus much more, that no Italian priest shall tithe or toll in our dominions. But as we unto heaven are supreme head, so unto him that great supremacy where we do reign, we will alone uphold without the assistance of a mortal hand. So tell the Pope, all reverence set apart to him and his usurped authority. It's a very Protestant kind of point of view. Defending his right to approve or disapprove of the appointment of an Archbishop of Canterbury, John responds to papal coercion by asserting that he has inviolable autonomy as a sacred king and that no Italian priest has power, including tithing power, in a realm where a monarch is supreme head, a phrase that might allude not only to secular regal authority in the Commonwealth, but also to the kind of authority Queen Elizabeth assumed as supreme governor of the English Church. From King John's point of view, and from that of most late Elizabethan English citizens, the Pope's alleged temporal power represents usurped authority. Later in the play, however, as the price of having the papacy use its international power to force the enemy French to back away from military confrontation, the English king is forced to yield to papal coercion, an act that results in the papal legates validating John's regal authority and treating it as a gift from the Pope. Handing him the crown, the cardinal says, "Take again from this my hand, as holding of the Pope your sovereign greatness and authority." The question of the relationship of monarchical to papal authority, of course, was a live one in the 1590s. In fact, a burning issue for the previous quarter century, and for a period well into the reign of the next English monarch, King James. In 1570, assuming a dozen years into her reign that there was no longer any hope of persuading Queen Elizabeth to restore Roman Catholicism as the official state religion, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull, Regnans in Excelsis, formally excommunicating the Queen and absolving her subjects, particularly her Catholic subjects, of any allegiance to her. The language of the bull is quite stark and strong. It characterizes Elizabeth as, quote, the pretended Queen of England, usurping, monster-like, the place of the chief sovereign of the Church of England, who prohibiteth the exercise of true religion, and embraceth the heresies of obscure persons, unquote, persecuting Catholics for their faith and loyalty to the true church. The Pope's formal pronouncement of excommunication is the rhetorical climax of the document, and this is quote number 2. Quote, "Being supported by his authority who hath placed us upon the sovereign throne of justice, however incapable of so great a charge, out of the fullness of our apostolic power, we do pronounce and declare the said Elizabeth an heretic and favorer of heretics, and those who adhere unto her in the foresaid things have incurred the sentence of anathema, and are cut off from the unity of the body of Christ. She is deprived of the right which she pretends to the foresaid kingdom, and of all and every seigneury, royalty, and privilege thereof, and the peers, subjects, and people of the said kingdom, and all others upon what terms soever sworn unto her, are freed from their oath and from all manner of duty, fidelity, and obedience. We do free them by authority of these presents, and exclude the said Elizabeth from the right which she pretendeth to the said kingdom, and the rest before mentioned. Commanding, moreover, and enjoining all and every the nobles as subjects, people, and others whatsoever, that they shall not once dare to obey her, or any of her directions, laws, or commandments, binding under the same curse those who do anything to the contrary." Unquote. This is an extreme case of using the power of the papacy claimed it had to depose monarchs, a right that rested partly on the claims of several medieval popes that their divinely sanctioned spiritual supremacy gave them the right to remove rulers in order to protect the spiritual health of the Christian commonwealth. Also used to legitimate direct or indirect papal power was the alleged donation of Constantine, supposedly granting popes temporal authority in the Western Roman Empire, a document that the humanist scholar Lorenzo Valla had exposed as a forgery. After the issuance of this bull, English Catholics were in an especially precarious position. The papacy seemed to recognize this. So when the Jesuits Robert Parsons and Edmund Campion were preparing in 1580 to undertake their mission to England to convert Protestants to Roman Catholicism and to reconcile lapsed Catholics, their questions about the bull were answered by a new pope, Gregory XIII, in a way that mitigated its harsh effects on English Catholics. He supposedly told them that the implementation of the bull was held in abeyance, rebus sixtantibus, in the present circumstances, and that Catholics were not being enjoined to undertake active opposition to the Elizabethan regime. Quote, "Catholics of England were not bound under pain of sin or excommunication by virtue of the bull published by Pius V. They are excused from the obligations laid down. No one is held today to obey an excommunication and a precept of his own grievous loss and injury of life, especially when harm to religion is added. Nor is it to be believed that the Church has wished so to bind Catholics," unquote. He's doing a real about-face here. That was then, this is now. This mitigation was put in place not only to facilitate the Jesuit missioners, who were specifically ordered by their superior general not to meddle in politics, but to recognize that realistically the change in religion the bull was designed to effect was a near impossibility by the 1580s. Quote, "Because the precept and the obligation seem to have been laid down as time and place required, within which there was hope of recovery of that realm by that way and manner, since such occasion has disappeared and the hope has been frustrated, and that avenue has been entirely blocked, it follows that the time of that precept has passed, and that obligation therefore ceases," unquote. Specifically, quote, "Catholics can with safe conscience obey Elizabeth in civil matters, and it is licit to cooperate in everything which is lawful under the governance of other tyrants, and it is well known that those of old did so also," unquote. Also, quote, "It is licit to call her queen, etc." The etc. means all the fancy titles that go with the queen, "because those titles are to be understood to be meant such as they are," unquote. I don't know what he means by that. On the other hand, if there were the possibility of actually overthrowing the queen and replacing her with a Catholic monarch, Catholics were urged to work to that end. Quote number 3, quote, "We think that Catholics are not held by virtue of the bull to the actions proposed unless everything has been so arranged that hope of victory is certain and ready, in which case the bull binds those who would be able to take any action by reason of the common good of the faith and religion. It is not lawful for a private person to kill any tyrant whomsoever has been defined by the Council of Constance, unless he was such as would get possession of the royal power after the example of Ehud, Judges 3:25-30. Pertinent to this is the case that if someone were able by the queen's death certainly to free the realm from oppression, doubtless it would be lawful for him to kill her. But things being in the position in which they are now, it is now much better not ever to talk at all about that matter, the way he's doing. If it were lawful to take up arms for the end and by means which have been explained, that is, prudently and not rashly, and in order that Catholics might be rescued from those harassments of body and mind which they were at the time afflicted. The Queen of England, not only because she is an heretical tyrant, but because she governs with the greatest harm and disturbance to the whole Church, can be lawfully deposed from royal power, even if no bull had been published, unquote. So there's taking away and then there's giving back in this quote. Although Catholics are to be assured that they did not have to expose themselves needlessly to persecution because of the bull, they're encouraged to overthrow, if not also kill, the Queen as an heretical tyrant. With some justification, then, English authorities could regard Catholics, after the issuance of the 1570 papal bull, as actual or potential traitors, sanctioned in their attempts to overthrow, if not also assassinate, a Protestant queen, whether in cooperation with foreign invaders or on their own. Thus, they devised the famous bloody questions that were put to Catholics, asking them, among other things, whether they accepted the legitimacy of Elizabeth's rule and whether they would fight on her side or on that of the Pope if a papally sanctioned invasion took place, unquote. The English government could, despite the assertions of Campion and his fellows that they entered the country on a pastoral, not a political mission, define Catholic missionaries sent from abroad as seditious and try them for treason. They would try for treason, not heresy. Following the death of Campion, in his execution of justice in England, 1583, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, Elizabeth's chief minister, defended the execution of Catholics, attacking the Pope's assertion of deposing power and defending English national sovereignty as inviolable. William Cardinal Allen, the chief Catholic cardinal in exile, in A True, Sincere, and Modest Defense of English Catholics, 1584, there's nothing very modest about it, defended the Pope's deposing power and the right of religious resistance. The Pope's claim to a right to depose monarchs in the name of preserving the health of the larger Christian commonwealth, or body of Christ, which gradually receded into the background in the modern world, was seen as an immediate and ongoing threat to Protestant rulers. It could portend foreign invasion and/or internal rebellion or insurrection. In 1585, Pope Sixtus V excommunicated Henry, King of Navarre, later King Henry of France, intervening in the bloody religious factionalism and struggles of France. Nascent modern nation-states could see the Pope's authority as a threat to national sovereignty and could view citizens who accepted this authority as inherently disloyal, if not treasonous. Of course, especially after the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and at the time of the Spanish Armada, Catholic authorities formulated the situation in similar black and white terms. English Catholics were the target audience of William Cardinal Allen's 1588, a declaration of the sentence and deposition of Elizabeth, which was designed to be disseminated once the Spanish invaders had landed in England. It identified Queen Elizabeth as a usurper, a persecutor of Catholics, and a tyrant unworthy of political allegiance. To legitimate Catholics assisting the planned invasion of England by the Duke of Parma's forces, Allen laid out the reasons for the Pope's deposing of England's Queen and sanctioning the overthrow of her government. I'm not going to read this long rant, which you have as quote number 4, but it says everything bad that possibly could have been said about Elizabeth by an English Catholic, and legitimates overthrowing her and killing her. The document promises a plenary indulgence to any Catholics assisting the papally authorized Spanish invaders and helping to overthrow the Queen. Not surprisingly, very few English Catholics were ready to follow these directions. But the document only solidified the English government's association of Catholicism with treason. Internal rebellion, especially when joined to foreign invasion, was horrifyingly repugnant to loyal Englishmen, including most Catholics. There's an interesting study called Catholic Loyalism in Elizabethan England. It shows that basically Catholics are English first and Catholics second. They didn't want to support a foreigner taking over the country. Catholic resistance theory underlay Allen's pamphlet. It was legitimate, according to this theory, to disobey and rebel against a ruler if he or she were a usurper or not a true heir to the throne, or failed to be legitimated by papal authority, or persecuted subjects, or overthrew the true religion. Allen uses the term tyrant for Elizabeth, especially because she had killed Catholic missionaries and Catholic laymen, some 180 by the end of her reign. Her predecessor, Queen Mary, was called for centuries Bloody Mary because she killed around 300 Protestants. Elizabeth was pretty bloody too. She imprisoned priests and bishops and substituted, from a Catholic point of view, a heretical church for a true one. Of course, there were some elements in common with Protestant resistance theory, especially with regard to the religion of the monarch and the actions that can flow from it. Within the borders of a particular nation, the question of king killing can relate to a purely domestic, political, or moral context. Within an international setting, the issue involves the question of national sovereignty and the possible rights of transnational entities to interfere in the governance of a particular country, either for religious or secular reasons. In our own world, the United Nations, NATO, and the International Criminal Court have all assumed that national sovereignty is not an absolute when it comes to preventing or punishing genocide and extreme violations of human rights. In the early modern world, in which nation-states were a relatively new phenomenon, Imperial Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy were all perceived as threats to national autonomy and to reformed religion, while from the other side, these entities could assert the right to protect subjects or citizens' access to a church and the means of salvation that Catholicism deemed necessary for their spiritual health. They could do this, if necessary, by foreign invasion aimed at regime change. On neither side was toleration or religious pluralism a desirable policy, since all conceived of church and state as inextricably bound. The fact that the universal, that is, Western European Christian Commonwealth, was no longer unified religiously, of course, complicated matters. One notable but limited exception to the model of religious uniformity, of course, was the France of Henry IV, who, in the wake of decades of destructive wars of religion, issued the 1598 Edict of Nantes, providing for limited toleration and civil rights of the Huguenot Protestant minority, a protection that lasted until the absolutistic Louis XIV revoked the edict in 1685, causing a mass exodus of French Protestants to England, to other European countries, and to the French colonies of the New World. And this had a big effect on the settlement in the New World. In the French Wars of Religion, which pitted Huguenots against the Spanish-supported Catholic League, the latter responsible for the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, a centrist group, the Politique, sought to achieve civil peace by looking for a way for the state to exist with, in effect, a Christian religious pluralism. Henry of Navarre, the Protestant who became the French king after formally converting to Catholicism. Paris is worth a mass, he said to have remarked cynically, was an example of this third way. His assassination in 1610 highlighted the difficulty of separating strong religious commitment from the pragmatics of governing a religiously fractured state in post-Reformation Europe. This figure, by the way, I'm going to get to Shakespeare sooner or later. This figure, by the way, loomed large in the English imagination, first for his Protestant heroism and then for his capitulation to Catholicism represented by his conversion. By the way, while Henry was still a Protestant, he is fictionally refracted in the figure of King Ferdinand of Navarre in Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost. Although French politics were the main context of his assassination, the act had international reverberations and, Protestant polemicists argued, motivations as well. In England, in the wake of the 1605 gunpowder plot, the possibility of regicide by Catholic agents prompted by papal or other international entities was felt as an ever-present threat. The internationally active Jesuits, for example, who were members of a religious order reporting directly to the Pope, were, for the English, the equivalent of the KGB. There's one famous English historian, J.E. Neal, who wrote a biography of Elizabeth and also a history of the parliaments, who compared the Jesuits, he was writing shortly after World War II, to Nazi spies. Maybe a bit of an overstatement. The Jesuits were blamed for instigating regicidal and terrorist acts against Protestant rulers. After the fact, the gunpowder plot was characterized by the government propaganda as the Jesuit treason. Between the 1570 issuance of the papal bull excommunicating Queen Elizabeth and absolving her subjects of allegiance to her, and the oath of allegiance controversy following the 1605 gunpowder plot, especially during the time of England's war with Spain, 1585 to 1604, the issue of the papal temporal power, including the right to depose monarchs, remained at the center of the strained relations between the English monarchy and the International Catholic Church, even after the 1604 peace treaty between England and Spain. During the trial of the gunpowder plotters, in which, I don't know if you know about the gunpowder plot, they moved 300 pounds of gunpowder under the Parliament building, and they were going to set it off when Parliament was opened by the King, and the King and the whole royal family, the House of Lords and the House of Commons would have been in one building at one time, and it would have blown the English political elite into smithereens. Fortunately for the English, they had a good spy system. They knew what was going on and stopped it. All right. During the trial of the gunpowder plotters, in which the Jesuit superior in England, Henry Garnet, was charged with misprision of treason, that is, of knowing about the plot ahead of time, if not also of encouraging it. In the official published account of the trial, which came out shortly after it, Sir Edward Coke, in his prosecutorial speech, accused the Jesuits of being committed to 2 Ds, deposing of kings and disposing of kingdoms, offering as an example the 1589 assassination of Henry III of France by Jacques Clement, a monk. Coke identified the 1570 papal bull as the basis of English Catholic subversiveness and treason, and acknowledgement of the Pope's power, that is temporal power, as a cornerstone of recusancy or of Catholic resistance to the official church. Tudor monarchs were preoccupied with regicide. The dynasty began with the killing of the Yorkist king, Richard III, and ended with the demise of an old, childless queen who had herself ordered the execution of a fellow monarch, who was haunted by the real and fictitious assassination plots and who survived a particularly inept attempt at a coup d'etat by the Earl of Essex, who had been negotiating politically by letter with James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, the son of the Queen Elizabeth had killed, and also one of the intended targets of the Catholic terrorist gunpowder plot of 1605. Theater companies were forbidden to depict contemporary politics or political figures on stage. But of course, they found indirect ways to do this. In the mid-1590s, Shakespeare's Richard II, which Professor Lemon is going to discuss in detail tomorrow in a very, very good paper, Richard II dealt with the problem of a monarch who was perceived as weak and ready to be overthrown, as he was by a strong, charismatic leader who became the first Lancastrian monarch, Henry IV. In her paper, Rebecca Lemon discusses how Richard is dramatized as acting tyrannically. In Hamlet, the prince notoriously states, "Something is rotten in the state of Denmark." In the last years of Elizabeth's reign, people believed something was rotten in England, though perhaps not rotten enough to justify regicide. Written toward the end of Elizabeth's reign and before the attempted coup by the Earl of Essex, to whom Shakespeare compared the eponymous hero of the play Henry V, and to whom he probably alluded in depicting the Danish prince Hamlet in a play inordinately. Let me start that sentence again. Written toward the end of Elizabeth's reign and before the attempted coup by the Earl of Essex, to whom Shakespeare compared the eponymous hero of the play Henry V, and to whom he probably alluded in depicting the Danish prince, Hamlet is a play inordinately preoccupied with king killing. It begins with the ghost of the murdered King Hamlet and ends with Prince Hamlet's assassination of his murderer uncle, King Claudius, an act that is more an afterthought in the final scene, not its climactic moment. There's no dramatic shouting of "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. When the itinerant players come to Elsinore, Hamlet asks them to recite some speeches from a scene in which Pyrrhus, the character, kills King Priam. The play within a play that Hamlet specifically requests, and to which he adds some lines, reenacts the regicidal murder of Hamlet Sr. In the closet scene with his mother, Hamlet kills a person behind the arras who might be the king, but who turns out to be Polonius, who had boasted that he played the role of another sovereign who was assassinated. Quote, "I did enact Julius Caesar. I was killed in the Capitol. Brutus killed me," unquote. In this very scene, Hamlet makes a strong alliterative association of kill and king. Regicides could be ideologically or politically motivated agents and or insane individuals. In the context of ideological struggle, their actions could be interpreted by their enemies as calculated and sane, following from the bad politics or bad religion to which they were bound. The French Dominican lay brother Jacques Clement, who was encouraged by the militant Catholic League to kill the Protestant Henry III, was praised by the Pope for his act. The addle-brained François Ravaillac, a disturbed loner who was inspired in 1610 by visions to kill the religiously amphibious Henry IV of France, who was planning at the time to go to war with Spain, could nevertheless be seen by the English Protestants as a Catholic zealot sent by papistical Jesuits to do away with someone whose politique and tolerationist behavior the Catholic hardliners perceived as a threat to the state and to true religion. William Shakespeare repeatedly dramatized king killing and the planning of king killing, a dangerous act in a country that could stretch the definition to include, as Rebecca Lemon has pointed out in her very good book, Treason by Words, Literature, Law, and Rebellion in Shakespeare's England. End of commercial. She has pointed out in her book, this also can involve encompassing or imagining the death of a monarch, an act that implied not only fantasy but also planning, such as that undertaken by the gunpowder plot conspirators in the early years of James's reign. Perhaps this is one reason why the act itself often takes place off stage, the act of killing a king. One does not have to look far to see king killing in Shakespeare's plays. Richard II, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and Duncan in the Scottish play, Claudius and Hamlet Sr., a dead king who won't stay dead, King Lear, who dies because his one good daughter has been murdered. Threats to kill kings abound. Rebellious nobles in Henry IV, Part 1, want to kill the king in battle, but instead discover a kind of multiplication of royal presence in the many figures disguised as Henry. Discontented nobles want to kill King Henry V before he embarks on his French invasion. Sebastian and Antonio conspire to kill King Alonso, and Caliban plans to assassinate Duke Prospero in The Tempest. In a recent essay, Stephen Greenblatt observes, quote, Shakespeare did not position himself squarely against the bloody unthroning of even anointed monarchs. Violence, he well understood, was one of the principal mechanisms of regime change, unquote. Perhaps the only other major author of the period who imagined as much king-killing was Sir Philip Sidney, whose Arcadian heroes, Pyrocles and Musidorus, actually do kill or overthrow evil monarchs, and are wrongly convicted of having killed King Basilius, who has not really died. In the late 16th century, largely because of religious fanaticism, several European rulers were assassinated. As I mentioned, Henry III and Henry IV of France, and William of Orange, the Protestant leader of the anti-Spanish rebellion in the Low Countries. According to the theory of sacred kingship, as developed in the Middle Ages and exploited in Protestant England by the Tudors, it was not just morally wrong, but also sacrilegious to kill a reigning monarch. To legitimate such an act, it was necessary to come up with compelling political, theological arguments justifying it. Such arguments were developed from an English point of view from the religious extremes by Catholic activists and by Protestant radicals, both of whom believed that they could justify resistance from below to authority from above if that authority could be delegitimated. One of the Catholic justifiers of tyrannicide was the Spanish Jesuit Juan de Mariana. After the assassination of Henry IV of France, his work was vilified because it was perceived as inviting the assassination. Mariana, however, carefully frames the situation in which it's licit to overthrow or kill a tyrant. First, he defines tyranny as an extreme of bad behavior on the part of a ruler. A ruler can be considered a tyrant, quote, if he destroys the republic, considers public and private fortunes as his own booty, holds public laws and sacred religion in contempt, and if he makes a virtue out of pride, brazenness, and impiety against heaven. This is a very extreme definition of tyranny. It is not up to the lone individual to make the judgment that a ruler is a tyrant who must be killed. Rather, according to Mariana, quote, the readiest and safest way is to debate what must be decided by common consent and to ratify and validate what has been decided by the common opinion, unquote. So it's a kind of social decision to overthrow a tyrant, not an individual's responsibility. Even at that point, the bad ruler must be given a chance to change his behavior. Quote, first the prince will have to be warned and summoned back to sanity. That's assuming there was sanity there in the first place. Not likely in the case of Caligula. Say. If he regulates his conduct, makes satisfaction to the republic, and corrects the faults of his past life, the process must be halted, unquote. Quote, if he spits out the medicine, however, and no hope of sanity is left, it will be permissible for the republic by a declared sentence first to reject his sovereignty. It will then be permissible to make plans for driving him out, to bring forth arms, to raise money from the people for the costs of war, and if the matter requires and the republic cannot be protected otherwise, by its same right of defense, and in truth by its better and proper authority, to declare the prince a public enemy and to slay him with a sword, unquote. Only after a general decision of this sort can, quote, any private citizen step forward in the attempt to help the republic, unquote, and to kill the ruler. If there are no opportunities for meetings and debate, the individual king killer still has to be responding to, quote, the people's prayers, unquote, not just to his own thoughts and desires. By Mariana's standard, the killings of William of Orange and Kings Henry III and Henry IV of France were unjustified, even though Protestant propaganda claimed the assassins were influenced by theories such as Mariana's and helped in their efforts by evil Jesuits. Mariana was a Jesuit, who sometimes gave them the sacrament before they undertook their deadly mission in order to define what they were doing as divinely sanctioned. Shakespeare alludes to the practice of giving the sacrament in Richard II, where the Duke of York is outraged in discovering a regicidal conspiracy against the newly crowned Henry IV of that play, in which his own son is involved, one in which the would-be assassins, quote, have ta'en the sacrament and interchangeably set down their hands to kill the king at Oxford, unquote. The Jacobean gunpowder plotters supposedly took the sacrament before embarking on their failed terrorist attack. By Mariana's standards, Hamlet's killing of Claudius is illicit. There is no general consent that Claudius is a tyrannical king. No deliberative process that reaches a conclusion that he should be overthrown. Only the unreliable promptings of a ghost from a theologically discredited purgatory. King Claudius is not a tyrant in any clear or certain way. He acts to protect his country by handling the invasion of Fortinbras. He seems to have the kind of rationality and decisiveness needed to govern well, and he enjoys the support of the political elite. With reference to the last, he remarks in his opening speech, defending his marriage to Gertrude and his assumption of rule, quote, nor have we herein barred your better wisdoms, which have freely gone with this affair along, unquote. We'll forget about the fact that he had to murder his way to the throne. On the other hand, he is a murderer. He twice arranges for the killing of his chief political rival, Prince Hamlet, and he's guilty of personal excesses such as drunkenness. The situation in Hamlet politically is interesting. It's different from England. Denmark has an elective monarchy, not a monarchy by primogeniture, so that you think that Hamlet would succeed his father as king, but no. It's a question of whom the political elite wants to succeed, Hamlet Sr. And they made a good decision. Hamlet would have been a terrible king. If we look at the contrast, Hugh Longuet and Philip Duplessis Mornay, the chief Protestant, some of the chief Protestant resistance theorists, the distinction they make in their classic articulation of Protestant resistance theory, Vindiciae contra Tyrannos, between the acceptable sovereign and the unacceptable tyrant, Claudius seems midway between the two. This is quote number 5 from the Protestant resistance theory. We must not expect princes absolute in perfection, but rather repute ourselves happy if those who govern us can be indifferently good. And therefore, although the prince observe not exact mediocrity or moderation, if sometimes passions overrule his reason, if some careless omission make him neglect the public duty, or if he do not always carefully execute justice with equality, or repulse not with ready valor an invading enemy, he must not therefore be presently declared a tyrant. But if a prince purposely ruin the commonwealth, if he presumptuously pervert and resist legal proceedings and lawful rights, if he make subjects into enemies, briefly, if he express all or the chiefest of those wicked practices we have formerly spoke of, then we may certainly declare him to be a tyrant who is as much an enemy of God as men. Cinna's explanation at Caesar's death, liberty, freedom, tyranny is dead, and Cassius's command that liberty, freedom, and enfranchisement be cried out from the common pulpits, seem not quite to fit the actual situation. Caesar's not a monster. He hasn't gotten to be a tyrant yet. He might be a tyrant. The line between non-resistance to a less than ideal king and resistance to a monstrous tyrant is tested in Macbeth by Malcolm, who falsely confesses to an increasingly outrageous series of faults and crimes that exceed even Macbeth's. Now, here's the kind of inventory of things that you need to do to become a tyrant. And this is a very long quote. I guess I'll read some of it, and the rest of it's on your sheet as quote number 6. When I shall tread upon the tyrant's head, or wear it upon my sword, yet my poor country shall have more vices than it had before, more suffer and more sundry ways than ever by him that shall succeed. He's saying, if you want me to be king, he's saying to Macduff, you're going to get somebody worse than Macbeth. And he goes and confesses all sorts of crimes, including personal crimes of luxuriousness, avariciousness, being false, deceitful, sudden, malicious, smacking of every sin that has a name. It's interesting that in a lot of resistance theory, tyrants are associated with sexual sins and crimes. This is true of Roman emperors. It's true of tyrants that are defined elsewhere. Interestingly, Macbeth isn't accused of any sexual misdeeds. That one feature of tyranny he doesn't have. In any event, after all these confessions of how bad he's going to be, he keeps on getting worse and worse and worse in what he's saying. Macduff, who wants him to be king, finally says, oh, no, what am I getting into? He finally provokes, Malcolm finally provokes the response in Macduff to his prompt, if such a one be fit to govern, speak. And Macduff says, fit to govern? No, not fit to live. And then Malcolm says, I was only kidding. I'm not really like that. The normal consequences of tyrannicide and regicide in Shakespeare's plays are quite various, running from the optimistic assumption of power by the first Tudor king, Henry of Richmond, and Richard III, and the scene of relief in Macbeth, whose society is seen as changing finally from a more tribal and medieval one to a more modern one, able to produce a leader such as King James, to the low-key assumptions of power by Fortinbras in Hamlet. He's a foreigner taking over the Danish throne. And Edgar and Albany in King Lear, to the immediate bloody civil war in Julius Caesar and the eventual War of the Roses resulting from the deposing and murder of Richard II. Certainly, political utopia is not the normal outcome of political killings in Shakespeare's plays. Last section. But I'm not going to end in 3 minutes. There may have been, in traditional political theory, a binary of divine right monarchy and republicanism, within which there was room for a middle ground of a mixed polity, or of what historians have recently called the monarchical republic. But in both the real world and its representation on stage, there was always a difference between political theory and political practice. And this, for dramatic reasons, was what interested William Shakespeare. As Eric Nelson has observed in a recent essay, quote, Shakespeare himself is highly dubious that constitutional form matters much at all, either for Rome or for any other commonwealth. Quote, Shakespeare's concern is with power and its consequences. His fundamental conviction is that the pursuit of personal ambition and the preparedness to use all means necessary to preserve power we have amassed is a great human constant. It organizes the political sphere in every regime, which suggests that the whole question of the best regime is a red herring, unquote. In early modern political theory, including resistance theory, there is a sliding scale of possibilities for describing royal legitimacy, from divine right absolutism, forbidding any resistance even to tyrants because power comes from God to the king, to monarchy constrained by a political elite, including major magistrates, to a broad notion of a contractual relationship between monarch and the governed, to a bottom-up notion of popular sovereignty that has in it the seeds of modern democracy. In that model, the whole Commonwealth cedes power to a king. That's where the power comes from, the populace. So it's from God to the people to the king, not from God to the king distributed. While Shakespeare dramatizes all these positions and shows the dangers of absolutistic and democratic extremes, he concentrates on the realities of political negotiating and the unsettledness of any one model of sovereignty or governance. The political context of his dramas, of course, changed from the last years of a queen who survived by playing both domestic political factions and foreign powers against one another, and using masterful public relations techniques, as Kevin Sharp has recently shown in a book about Tudor propaganda, to the early years of a king who articulated a strong theory of divine right monarchy that functioned above the law. He said famously to the Parliament once, "Rex est lex," the king is the law. Oh yeah? Even he knew that wasn't the truth. The king who was the target of a failed Catholic terrorist plot, who was averse to staging himself for a popular audience, as Elizabeth had, and who developed an antagonistic relationship with a succession of parliaments. Just as it is unimaginable to think of Shakespeare writing a play such as Richard II or King John for a Jacobean audience during James's rule, it was unimaginable to think of his composing Measure for Measure or Macbeth for an Elizabethan audience. Weak kings were unwelcome to James as dramatic protagonists, and mystified absolutists were alien figures for Elizabeth. The relationship of monarchism and republicanism is particularly clear in the work of Niccolo Machiavelli, and although his writings were an integral part of the early modern intellectual tradition of republican thinking, his reputation was tied to more unvarnished statements he made about amoral political pragmatism in a work such as Il Principe. Whatever the political system, Machiavelli knew it was inevitable for ambitious and unscrupulous individuals to manipulate it. A cynical dramatist such as Christopher Marlowe demonstrated what was called Machiavellian policy in action, but so did William Shakespeare. And Richard II, in case members of his audience did not know the fine details of that monarch's reign, Shakespeare presents in the second scene of the play an exchange between the widowed Duke of Gloucester and John of Gaunt that provides an essential context for the two scenes that flank it. The scene presents information that all of the characters in the drama know, specifically that Richard ordered the death of his political enemy, the Duke of Gloucester, who was, in the historical record, hardly a saint. And this forces the audience to reinterpret the first scene of the play, where Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, accuses Thomas Mowbray of the treasonous murder of Gloucester. Bolingbroke is clearly mounting an indirect moral, legal, and political attack on Richard himself, in the light of which Richard breaks off the trial by combat of Act 1, Scene 3, before, according to traditional belief, God could level a negative judgment not just on Mowbray, but on him. If you believe the trial by combat is God's way of settling the issue of who's right and who's wrong, Richard would have been judged guilty indirectly in that if he had let the trial take place. Despite eliciting audience sympathy for Bolingbroke, whose emotional farewell to England and to his aged father is his most attractive moment in the drama, Shakespeare lays the foundation for characterizing Bolingbroke as a Machiavellian political manipulator, a master of public relations and of strategizing for power. His later actions underscore this reality. His invasion of England from abroad was planned and begun chronologically before the king's seizure of his inheritance, which he publicly claims was the reason for returning from exile. His punishment of the corrupt flatterers of the king is deceptively justified as a rescue of the queen from abuse by a husband whose minions, quote, broke the possession of a royal bed, unquote, supposedly like Marlowe's Edward II through homosexual relations, a situation contradicted by the queen's later professions of love and loyalty to Richard. His forgiveness of the rebellious O'Merle is a political act colored by his own vulnerability with regard to his truant son, the heir apparent. Finally, his rhetorical solicitation of the murder of Richard by a man named Exton is designed to give him political deniability, just as Queen Elizabeth's pretense that she didn't know she was signing Mary Queen of Scots' death warrant was meant to exculpate her. She sent her Secretary of State, William Davison, to prison for this supposed deception. Supposedly, she was given a whole bunch of papers, one under the other, and she had to sign here, 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 here. She knew she was signing the death warrant, but she didn't want to claim responsibility for killing a legitimate monarch. Mary was Queen of Scotland. In many respects, Bolingbroke is a tragic villain, as is his dramatic descendant, King Claudius in Hamlet. Shakespeare, in many ways, keeps on writing the same characters over and over again with a twist. Claudius of Hamlet, who has executive ability and who can manipulate both public opinion and the politically less skillful Hamlet, who is a reprise of Richard II in many ways. Machiavellian politicians who are outright villains abound in Shakespeare's plays. Richard III, Cassius and Julius Caesar, Iago in Othello, Macbeth in what's called the Scottish play, the tribunes in Coriolanus, Octavius in Antony and Cleopatra. But to return to the historical context and the consequences of the Lancastrian overthrow of a Yorkist King Richard II, the behavior of Prince Hal in the Henry IV plays, and as king in Henry V, there are clear Machiavellian contours. Shakespeare manipulates his low-life Prince Hal in the Henry IV plays becomes King Henry V. He masterfully manipulates his low-life companions as well as his father in the Henry IV plays, which culminate in the rejection of Falstaff that haunts the action of Henry V. In Henry V, the king clearly puts his bishops in the position of either morally endorsing a foreign adventure or invasion that's a distraction from domestic difficulties. If you read the history, it's clear that Henry is doing what a lot of rulers do, settling a turmoil and disturbance that's domestic by undertaking a foreign invasion, like invading Iraq, and having that foreign invasion as a distraction and a justification. All right. So Henry puts the bishops in a position of endorsing this adventure or losing church property. His charismatic military leadership, especially evident in his St. Crispin's Day speech, as maybe some of you have seen either one or both of the movies that have been made out of the Henry V play, one by Laurence Olivier in World War II, the other one by Kenneth Branagh. This charismatic military leadership is revealed as a public relations strategy to mask the differential realities of warfare for noble versus plebeian fighters, exposed in the common soldier Williams's criticisms before the climactic Battle of Agincourt. He's saying that warfare is all well and good for the aristocrats who can get ransomed back to their country. It's the common soldiers who get killed and become cannon fodder. Henry orders his troops to kill prisoners using the pretext of avenging the French slaughter of the boys guarding the luggage. This is a clear violation of the traditional rules of warfare. And his bumbling lover pose in the final scene of the play is a ruse to disguise the hard-edged political coercion he's applying to the French royal family. Henry is good at what he does, but what he does is exercise Machiavellian policy. Incidentally, Kenneth Branagh's post-Vietnam era film version of this play captures this aspect of Henry's character, while Sir Laurence Olivier's candy-colored World War II era chauvinistic version does not. In Macbeth, Shakespeare alludes to the recent gunpowder plot. The potential horrors fit well into the brutal nightmare atmosphere of this tragedy, and they played into King James's political paranoia. Murder of a saintly king, Duncan, who differs greatly from the flawed figure of Scottish history, is not driven by sectarian religious desperation, as was the plot, simply by the lust for power, the pragmatic goal of most political actors, including some popes. In early modern Europe, in which new nation-states were being formed and strengthened as polities, there were tensions between individual countries or provinces and transnational entities such as the Holy Roman Empire, Spanish imperial power, and the papacy that asserted its alleged right to depose, delegitimate, and even authorize the assassination of particular monarchs or rulers. In England, the 1570 papal bull excommunicating Elizabeth and freeing her Catholic subjects from political allegiance to her was a watershed event. It entered the nascent historical narrative of England as a fundamentally Protestant nation, threatened by international Catholicism, and through the papacy, and though the papacy eventually renounced its supposed deposing power, this configuration persisted in Western culture for a long time. So the sovereign nation state has as its enemy some kind of international power that would intrude upon it. This resurfaces very interestingly in the 1960 United States presidential election campaign of the Catholic John Kennedy, who had to appear before a meeting of Southern Baptist leaders to assure them he would not, if he was elected, take his orders from the Pope. This may seem like a joke to some people, but he really had to do this. It also accounts for right-wing American opposition to the United Nations and American governmental resistance to allowing its soldiers and citizens to be subject to the International Criminal Court. So this model of defensive absolutistic national sovereignty versus international intrusion or judgment is something that carries over in different forms. All right. Today, perhaps only Islamic radicals would favor invasion or subversion of a country in order to set up a new religious order. In early modern Europe, it took a lot of religious warfare and persecution, culminating in the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, to discredit finally the idea that international powers such as the papacy had the right and obligation to overthrow rulers in the name of so-called true religion. Religious struggles, theories of religious and political resistance, with or without their international dimensions, disputes about the proper constitution of the state between monarchists and republicans, all registered on William Shakespeare. But if we can judge from the way he dramatized these issues, he maintained a deep-rooted skepticism because that allowed him to stage the conflicts as dramatically interesting and nuanced human behavior in a world in which stark religious or political binaries distorted the ways human beings lived their lives. Recent discussions of Shakespeare and religion have led most scholars to conclude that it's impossible on the basis of his writings to identify him as either a committed Protestant or Roman Catholic. But this does not mean that he was insensitive to the religio-political issues of his time in their national and international contexts.